Hi everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Drew Koenig. I mispronounced his last name the last time he was on the podcast, but I am making this right this time, and we're talking all about Cycle of the Werewolf today. It's one of Stephen King's novellas, but it's a little more unique because it has a ton of illustrations that go along with it, and I think just make it a different experience. But Drew, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this. How are you doing today?
I'm good. It's good to be back. I've had a I've had a fun adventure the last couple of days of trying to find a way to read this particular book.
It is one that is very hard to find. I lucked out, and one of the libraries somewhat nearby me had a copy, and it was of the 1985 paperback edition of this, and I was like, yes. And it looked like no one had ever checked it out. I was like, has anyone
Nice.
even read this since the 80s? And I was like, how is it still in the library? But I wasn't complaining. But yeah, it's one of those things because it was never later collected in one of his short story collections where most of his novellas end up. I was like, what happened to this? And I guess because of the illustrations, they probably don't want to publish it in like a mass market paperback where you don't get to see the full effect of the graphics and everything like that. So I do get it in that sense. But yeah, it was one of the more unique things on this list because when I was going through and making up the list of everything that I wanted to cover, I came across this and I was like, why have I never heard of this? And it's mostly because my mom did not buy it when she was buying all of the Stephen King books when they were first coming out. And it just blew my mind that this novella had slipped by me. And I was like, now I'm kind of intrigued. And then I found out it was also later adapted into a movie called Silver Bullet. So it's one of those kind of like the Body novella story where they changed the name for the movie, so you don't necessarily put two and two together, but Silver Bullet totally makes sense as a name for this story. But why don't we go ahead and dive on into the plot, because this is interesting in how it's set up. You go month by month basically, and you follow a good chunk of people in the town. So what did you think of just the overall story of it, following all of these different people and having it set in a monthly setting basically?
Yeah, I think it goes nicely with the kind of element of this where like it's a rare kind of Stephen King story, and it's trying to do something entirely different than like most stories that Stephen King writes.
Right.
Where like there are like illustrations to go along with like each month, and it is a bit I mean, it's recognizable in the sense that it's a Stephen King story and it's kind of like meandering in its pacing.
Yeah.
But it's put out there like in a way that is fairly unusual for a Stephen King story,
Yeah, it's almost like, I don't know if you've read the Batman comic The Long Halloween, but that has these issues that go basically by holiday, which is a very interesting way to break down a story, and it's actually one of my favorite comics ever. And this kind of reminded me of that formatting, and then to have it be a literal cycle of a werewolf, every full moon and everything like that. So it sort of sticks with the theme, cycle of the werewolf. We're going to go through a monthly cycle here. That's going to be what it is. And this takes place in the small town of Charkers Mills, Maine. So it's not Castle Rock, it's a new little place here, but you are following mostly Marty Coslaw and the Reverend who becomes the werewolf, Reverend Lester Lowe. And along the way, you get a bunch of the people who are killed because the werewolf is going after them. And, Marty is one of the victims as well. But even as a paraplegic, he's able to defend himself, which I find very empowering for someone with a disability like that. And I think Stephen King does a good job of really portraying that character as one of the stronger characters in the story.
Right, yeah, like this is the de facto hero of the story, Like this is the person that's going to come out and they're going to save the day, for lack of a better term, and they're going to take on the werewolf. There's a kind of like Losers Club-esque feel to him,
he's certainly someone who feels like he would fit right in with that band of characters from it. And I like that he doesn't have to be this physically fit person to defeat this werewolf. Instead, he uses what he has on hand. Oh, here's some firecrackers. Let me use those. And it works to his advantage. And then later on, he goes and kills him with the silver bullet, which is one of the few ways you can kill a werewolf. I'm not entirely up on all of the ways you can kill a werewolf, but I know that is a very, very popular one.
Yeah. And it's very Stephen King to play within those kind of tropes, where it's like, this is a silver bullet, here's a werewolf, and it's gonna be kind of pulpy and fun, but also terrifying, which the illustrations really help in that regard.
I also love the inclusion of Uncle Al. You know, there's some family tension going on. He doesn't get along very well with Marty's mother, who is his sister, but Uncle Al is still sort of hanging around, and he's the one who buys the fireworks, if I'm not mistaken. And, you know, he also gives him the silver bullet. So he's a character who is really empowering Marty to take matters into his own hands as much as he's able to. And it works out in the end, because even though Marty has to kill someone who he is familiar with,
it's hard not to compare the uncle in the book not to the uncle in the movie, because like there's a lot more emphasis on that uncle being pretty much like the town drunk.
Yeah.
And like having a like difficult relationship with everyone around him except for Marty. And I feel like there was a bigger emphasis on the sister character in the movie, but again, have not watched it in 15 years, so I cannot say that with any kind of confidence.
Yeah, I have not seen it at all, but it does look like it has a pretty big name cast for the time, so it'll be interesting to see how that compares to this in the long run. But one of the other things with the plot that I definitely want to talk about are the victims, because you have quite a few of them. You know, he doesn't quite get to 12 victims, but he gets up there. You know, it's a lot, and even though it's only happening once a month, you know, all of these are pretty brutal, and he does not distinguish between killing adults and killing children. So it's sort of just a free-for-all when it's a full moon, and you really get the sense that this is getting to the heart of the town throughout the year. And I think another thing that Stephen King does pretty well is making the town feel like a character in a lot of these stories, especially because of the fact that they are small towns in Maine. And you sort of just have this community feeling about a lot of these towns. And I think that just sort of makes it such a big deal when something like this happens in a town like that.
Yeah, there's a kind of a communal. It kind of reminded me of Jaws, especially when they're talking about like shutting down 4th of July, where it's like, this is a huge endemic fear. It's not just the threat, it's the how this affects the town through that kind of fear and paranoia, you know?
Yeah. I think this, even though it's a very, very quick read, it's something that kind of sticks with you for a while. You know, I read this, I don't even know how long ago it was. It had to have been at least a month or so ago. And I didn't even really feel like I needed to consult my notes. You know, I kind of just have Wikipedia up so I can remember exact names, because there are quite a few names to keep straight just in this short amount of page space that he uses. You know, the novella is 127 pages, but you have to figure almost half of those pages consist of the images from Bernie Wrightson. So you have all of this imagery to go along with it. And that's actually something I think we should dive into here, because you pretty much start each month with an illustration, and you have 2 or 3 more throughout, you know, that month. And I really think that Bernie Wrightson is just such a great fit for the kinds of stories that Stephen King tells. And I don't think this is the only time the two have worked together, because there are some copies of Stephen King books, like when I was reading The Dark Tower, the Gunslinger copy that I have, it had little images at the top of each chapter. So, he has a lot of different ways that he can tell these stories. He's telling a majority of it through his writing, but then there's a portion being told through Bernie Wrightson's illustrations as well.
Right. Yeah, it kind of reminded me of the beginning chapter of every like Harry Potter novel, where there'd be like this little thing to get you through that chapter.
Yeah,
this little snippet to show you. And
yeah, that was how the Gunslinger was. And I don't believe that Bernie Wrightson was the one who did those illustrations, but he's done Creepshow, and he does do one of the Dark Tower books. It looks like he does Wolves of the Calla illustrations, and I have not cracked that book open, so I don't know if I have that version of the book. Hopefully I do, because I definitely love seeing this. And he also did illustrations for the complete and uncut edition of The Stand, which is not the copy I have, unfortunately. So I had the shorter copy there for that one, but I just really enjoyed the illustration style. I was like, yes, this is kind of what I would expect for a werewolf story. And you really get the sense that this just kind of comes full circle and completes the horror feel.
Yeah, well, it's very like striking and horrific, like they're all just there. There's the chapter with the constable being killed by the werewolf,
right,
which is does not hold back, really. It's showing the werewolf like scratching at his face and like peeling back the skin, and it's it's very upsetting, but like it's very effective in its visceralness.
Even just the writing for that portion feels so visual. It's like you can see in your head everything that's happening. And then you get these actual illustrations, which obviously aren't nearly as graphic as what is actually happening to the constable, because, I think they toned it down just enough to where you sort of just get this horror feel without having it need to be gory.
Mm-hmm.
So the illustrations are just something that I thought kind of put this story over the top for me. And I honestly liked this a lot more than I was expecting. I'm not someone who is huge on vampires and werewolves. I watched the Vampire Diaries way longer than I probably should have. And I didn't even come close to finishing the series. I think I watched through like season 4 maybe, and it just went on so much longer. I was like, wait, there's how many spin-offs of this now? And it just amazed me how long that existed. But I think with what Stephen King is able to do with, the horror genre with vampires and werewolves, he's giving you these supernatural elements, but he's not overdoing it too much. I felt like this was just the right amount of character work with the supernatural mixed in to where you get a full story out of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I think I mentioned this the last time I came on, but he does these like weird horror stories, but filled with like a strange amount of humanity.
Yeah.
Like, I was reading an article about this on The Guardian, and they were talking about how this was released during a section of time when Stephen King was going through drug addiction.
Right.
And they kind of parallels between that and The Preacher, who is normally this very nice, mild-mannered man, good man, arguably, and then becomes this kind of horrible monster that he can't control. And the way that probably fed through a lot of Stephen King's writing, especially while writing this, and a lot of the other stories that came out during this period of time. So, like, Stephen King always has, like, that kind of sympathetic edge to it,
Yeah.
It's kind of weird humanism.
Yeah, it's also interesting to me that this isn't a book that's easy to find. You mentioned having a little trouble finding it, and I had one library to choose from pretty much to get it, and there are several libraries nearby. So, to only have one have the thing I'm looking for is somewhat uncommon, not completely uncommon, but it just kind of depends. But it says here on the Stephen King wiki page for it that this novella and The Colorado Kid are the only two Stephen King novels that have only been published in paperback once. So this originally came out as a hardcover. And that sort of makes sense because it is an odd size too, just because of the illustrations. It's not your typical paperback size book necessarily, but to have a hardcover copy of this must be amazing, because even checking Amazon and things like that, I was like, where is this? Where can I find this? And it's one of those things where people are selling it for, like $40 or $50 or something like that. So, if you hadn't been able to find it, I don't know if this necessarily would have made the cut for the podcast, just because I'm not trying to have my guests, spend like $50 for a book that's, less than 150 pages.
Well, yeah, I was kind of surprised just in the amount of time since I last read this, which was like 2002, 2003, and it was, I want to say, readily available. I could find it at a bookstore at least, it was on the Stephen King bookshelf. And now I think I looked at 3 or 4 bookstores in my city. I looked at the library. None of them had it. And it was kind of funny to me. We're like, this is kind of like one of those TV shows you hear about where it's like, you can watch it, but it's really expensive because the music rights are insane now. But have fun.
Or it's like trying to watch Mr. Mercedes because it's only available if you have AT&T, and then it's only available on DVD like months after the season ends. I finally bought the season 1 DVD for that, but it's not on Blu-ray, which is odd for this day and age. It's only on DVD, which, that happens to work for me because we only have a DVD player here. So it was one of those things where I was like, oh, that's a very weird way to not make something available, because it doesn't seem like Mr. Mercedes is hitting, Netflix or anything anytime soon either. It's very exclusive. Yeah. And this almost feels like an exclusive streaming right. It's like, only Netflix has this, and you have to get Netflix if you want to watch it. But in this case, only people who bought this book when it came out have it, apparently, and very few other places.
Yeah. Or like, I was finally at like the end of my rope. I was like, I always want to like go out of my way and pay you money for the thing that I'm partaking in. I want to be able for this to be a goods and services type of transaction. But I have a policy where, like, if you don't make it available for me in any reasonable way, I think I'm allowed to take a quote-unquote less legal route, which is what I was forced to do in this case. Where, like, I had to find a, like, transcript of it online because I don't know where it is.
Yeah.
And that seems unreasonable.
It definitely does, and you also have a movie tie-in edition for the paperback, so it's actually titled Silver Bullet, but even that paperback you can't find. It's like, why did you do this?
Yeah, it's like, I understand that the artwork is really good. It's really great.
Yeah.
This does not amount to $50.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Like, you want to put some of this on, like, a poster? Fine, we'll have a discussion. Until then, I don't think so.
Yeah, it's very odd how some of these things end up playing out. You would think this was like an exclusive one-time only thing. And, for all we know, maybe it was. It was like, here's the hardcover, here's the paperback. That's all you're getting. Thanks.
Well, from what I read about it, from what little research I did today, this did like the typical Stephen King in the 70s or 80s things where it was released as a vignette like once a month to match the style. So like you would get a month, and then I guess they just put it all together, sort it out, and then they're like, all right, we're done here.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how certain things were released, especially like you said, like back in the 80s and everything, because you do have things that were done a little differently just with publishing companies in general. And I know that some of Stephen King's works were released in, like you said, this was released monthly for each month or something like that. But then you have The Green Mile later on, which was published as 6 sort of novellas, and then they later combined them into one whole book. So it's like you kind of could subscribe to the book to get the full story. And, I don't think too many places are doing that today. At least I haven't seen that as of late with publishing companies, but the story more than makes up for kind of how difficult it is to find. At least for me it did, because, you know, neither of us ended up paying $50 for this. So
No,
it was one of those things where I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm very glad the library had this, because I was pleasantly surprised by how much I ended up enjoying the story. And it also helps when it's a quick read from Stephen King, because you don't get those too often. So you sort of have to enjoy them when they come.
Oh yeah, it's no time at all. You pretty much fly through it, which I think that's what makes me like it a bit more. Added with the illustrations here, what turns it into, you know, a pretty mid-tier Stephen King story into something slightly higher than that, but not a lot higher. It's still like a fine Stephen King story, you know?
Yeah, I wouldn't say, you know, it's 5-star work or anything like that. I actually don't even recall what I rated this on Goodreads. Let me see if I can find it here, and we can do some live follow-up on the podcast. But in the meantime, do you have any final thoughts on the book?
No, I think I summated myself pretty well right there.
Yeah, I gave it a 3 out of 5. So that's not bad. You know, I liked it enough. And I think every once in a while I'll find myself talking about something and then I feel like I end up enjoying it a little more, which could be the case for this. So maybe if Goodreads would let me, I would give it a 3.5 out of 5, but they do not allow for half stars yet. I'm going to keep complaining about that until they do.
I think I would go with a 2.5 if Goodreads let me, but so pretty much right down the middle.
Yeah. And that's fine.
Yeah.
I don't expect every single person who reads something from Stephen King to think it's, you know, 5 out of 5-star material. You know, I don't even think that myself, but I do enjoy the experience of reading all of these different stories, and especially this one being in such a different format than the rest. It was just something that caught my eye and I thought was pretty intriguing. And like I said, you know, similar to Batman's The Long Halloween, but not nearly as good. I'm sorry, Stephen King, but Long Halloween is one of my favorite comics ever. So, you know, that kind of does the month-to-month story a little better. In that case, holiday to holiday. So, you know, I think this is, like you said, totally fine. You know, the illustrations give it that little push. But, you know, I would still recommend that if people can find it, they go check it out, just because it is more of a unique reading experience than I think most of his other work it would be. So, you know, it's just one of those things. If you get to it, cool. If you don't, it's not like you're missing out on a huge part of his works or anything. It's not like you're skipping it or something like that, which is daunting. You know, I haven't even read that yet, but I'm getting closer and closer to it, and I'm like, oh, this is coming up, and I'm excited, but oh, it's coming up, and it's going to be a lot of work.
Yes, understandable.
Yeah. Well, Drew, thank you again for coming on to talk about this. I am sure you will be back on for some more future episodes. I know you're down for a few things at some point in the future.
I am indeed.
I don't know how far in the future, but in the future.
I will see. I will see what I'm already down for.
Okay, sounds good. And to our listeners, you can follow Chat Sematary on Twitter and Instagram. It's just at Chat Sematary on both, so nice and easy to find. Subscribe on Apple, Google, wherever you choose to listen to your podcast. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.